Inspector Nolan never sees a thing. We pay him off." Chloe Kane's voice landed like a hammer. Harlan West stopped mid-bite. The sandwich in his hand lost all taste. Those anonymous warnings dismissed for months were not lies. They were confessions waiting to surface. Across the diner, life went on cups. Clinked voices rose and fell, but to Harlan everything narrowed to that one sentence. The casual arrogance, the certainty of immunity told him this was no rumor. It was a system. His pulse steadied not from calm, but from clarity. What he had stumbled into was not a single bribe, but the doorway to a hidden empire. And the empire Victor Kane had built would fall. Harlan West had once signed contracts in boardrooms 40 stories high. 23 restaurants bore his name, and thousands of employees depended on his judgment. He knew profit margins, supply chains, and the language of growth. Now he sat in worn clothes, his beard untrimmed, his presence reduced to anonymity. The man who once dictated corporate futures carried himself like another customer passing through. That fall from the top was not accident. It was choice. He had traded suits for an old jacket, comfort for disguise, prestige for invisibility. He did it not to escape power, but to test the honesty of those who served under it. The paradox was sharp a leader with wealth and reach now hiding as a man with nothing. It was in that disguise that he could measure the true weight of loyalty, justice, and fear. His motive was not greed. It was protection of every worker who trusted him, of every diner who ate without question. Behind the beard, behind the plain jacket, remained a man unwilling to let corruption spread unchecked. The disguise stripped him of privilege, but not of purpose. He had stepped down from the tower to face the dirt, and the dirt was thicker than he imagined. Victor Kane greeted each customer with the ease of a man who had lived his entire life behind a counter. His handshake was firm, his smile broad, his memory sharp, with names and faces. He asked about children, remembered anniversaries, and raised toasts to loyalty. To the casual eye, he was the picture of a neighborhood guardian, a man whose reputation rested on years of honest labor. But beneath the smile was calculation. The warmth of his voice masked the chill of his intentions. Victor Kane was no simple diner owner. He was the architect of a system that thrived on deception. The family pride he boasted about was not tradition, but cover. It excused the unseen favors, the unexplained clean records, the silence of inspectors. His talk of legacy was meant to sanctify corruption, to make it appear like heritage rather than crime. The contrast was deliberate. Customers saw a host who cared. Employees saw a ruler who demanded. And Harlan, watching from his corner, saw the truth. Every grin Victor offered was another brick in the wall that hid his empire of bribery. The more Victor charmed, the deeper the suspicion grew. Chloe Kane entered the diner like she owned more than the floor beneath her heels. At 22, she dressed as if the world owed her attention, bright colors, polished jewelry, an aura sharpened by entitlement. She carried the name Kane like a weapon, flashing it in every sentence. Where Victor cloaked corruption in smiles, Chloe paraded it in arrogance. She bragged about the influence of her family, laughed at the idea of accountability, and spoke of rules as though they were childish obstacles. Every phrase dripped with disdain for those who lacked her shield. "Our family cannot be touched," she repeated with pride, her words crafted to sting. In her voice was not just confidence, but provocation, daring anyone to object. Customers humored her, employees endured her, but the imbalance was clear. Her presence was not charm, but pressure, an open reminder of power without consequence. For Harlan, listening nearby, Chloe was not a distraction. She was evidence. Her vanity turned secrets into spectacle. Her pride turned corruption into casual conversation. If Victor built the fortress, Chloe was its loudest trumpet, and in that trumpet lay the arrogance that would one day break it. Maria Lopez moved through the diner with quiet precision, her tray balanced with care, her steps practiced from years of repetition. She rarely spoke beyond what duty required, and when she did, her voice barely rose above the clatter of plates. Yet her silence carried more than shyness. It carried weight. When Chloe Kane's careless boast about bribed inspections reached her ears, Maria froze for half a breath. Her hand tightened on the coffee pot, her eyes flicked toward the floor, then toward the kitchen door as if measuring escape. To any stranger, the movement was nothing. To Harlan, watching closely, it was revelation. She knew. She had lived under this truth long before he stepped inside. Her face composed for customers betrayed unease in the corners of her eyes. Worry pressed into every gesture, but so did endurance. She was the kind of worker who endured humiliation rather than risk a job, who carried fear like a second uniform. For the audience, the signal was unmistakable. Maria was not blind. She had seen enough to confirm what Chloe treated like casual gossip. But her silence told a harder story: knowledge without safety, truth without voice. That silence wrapped her in sympathy, drawing attention to the cost of survival under Victor Kane's rule. She embodied the quiet suffering that corruption demanded, and in her stillness lay a plea unspoken. Maria Lopez was no whistleblower yet, but she carried the burden of truth in every glance. Daniel Cruz pushed through his shift with the weight of necessity. Each plate he carried was heavier than it looked, not because of the food, but because of the rent it had to cover, the school fees it had to pay, the unborn child it had to protect. He worked with urgency, not ambition. Survival carved lines into his face, younger than his years. Victor Kane's presence shadowed him constantly. A raised brow, a cutting remark, a public rebuke for the smallest mistake, Daniel bore them all. The fear of losing his position kept him tethered, but his eyes betrayed a spark that words could not. Beneath the exhaustion lingered resistance, faint but alive. Harlan noticed it. That flicker of defiance surfaced whenever Chloe's arrogance grew loud or Victor's reprimands turned cruel. Daniel's jaw would tighten, his stare harden, then soften again into practiced obedience. It was a rhythm of suppression, anger rising, fear choking it back. The contrast painted Daniel as more than another weary worker. He was a man forced into silence by circumstance, yet unwilling to extinguish the fire within. His struggle was visible in the smallest gestures, in the clenched grip of a tray, in the glance that lingered too long on injustice. He embodied the cost of intimidation and the possibility of rebellion. His presence whispered of battles fought within, of words swallowed, of choices yet to come. Daniel Cruz was not only a victim, he was a storm waiting for the moment to break. Agnes Miller had spent more than a decade behind those counters, her hair graying under fluorescent lights, her hands carrying trays, long past the age most would rest. She moved slower than the others, but with the steadiness of habit. If anyone knew the rhythm of Kane's diner, it was her, and yet she never spoke of it. When Chloe bragged about inspectors, Agnes did not flinch outwardly. Instead, her eyes softened with something more dangerous than ignorance: resignation. She glanced at Maria with quiet pity, as though to warn her not to react, not to betray what she already knew. It was a look that revealed the unspoken culture surrounding them. Silence as survival, compliance as protection. Agnes had seen too much long enough to understand the futility of resistance. Her silence was not approval. It was surrender. For Harlan, the glance carried as much weight as Chloe's boasting. The corruption did not only thrive on arrogance at the top, it thrived on fear at the bottom. The system was not hidden, it was accepted. The employees wore it like invisible chains, some heavy with fear, some worn down by time. Agnes represented that second group, the ones who chose not to fight but to endure. In her silence lay a cliffhanger of its own. How many more like her had turned away from truth simply to survive? The audience was left unsettled. Fear was not isolated, it was institutional. And Agnes, with one silent look, proved it. Inspector Nolan's name surfaced often in the diner, always with a tone of familiarity, never with suspicion. He was not introduced as a public servant, but as a family friend. Customers had seen him seated beside Victor Kane at corner tables, laughing over meals, trading stories as though nothing bound him to duty. His visits were never random. They came with uncanny precision: afternoons when the kitchen gleamed, when staff stood perfectly arranged, when Chloe carried herself with smug certainty. Nolan's timing was too neat, his presence too convenient, and every report that followed spoke of flawless conditions. Not once in years had he written a violation. For outsiders, it looked like efficiency. For anyone listening closely, it smelled like complicity. The man tasked with enforcing safety had become part of the very system that undermined it. Harlan noted the details carefully. Nolan's friendship with the Kanes, the meals shared the pattern of clean inspections. What Chloe had blurted was no exaggeration. It was routine. The inspector was not a watchdog. He was a shield. The audience could feel the betrayal sharpen. A role meant to protect had been sold, and the cost of that sale was trust itself. Kane's diner looked nothing like the nest of corruption it was. To anyone walking in, it felt safe, almost nostalgic. The walls carried framed photographs of smiling families, of Victor shaking hands with regulars of generations sharing meals at the same tables. Checkered cloths covered the booths, light reflected warmly off polished surfaces, and the aroma of comfort food filled the air. Every seat was often taken. Construction crews came after shifts, retirees lingered for hours, office workers stopped for lunch. They trusted the food without question, trusted the smiles behind the counter, trusted the spotless reputation repeated in whispers around the city. That trust was the cruelest irony. Customers believed they were entering a place upheld by tradition and integrity, when in reality they sat inside a fortress of deceit. The very images that promised honesty were the camouflage for dishonor. For Harlan, the contradiction was clear. The more perfect the mask, the more rot it concealed. What the public celebrated as reliability was in fact an illusion sustained by bribes and silence. The diner stood as a paradox in brick and mortar, a home of comfort on the surface, a hub of corruption beneath. Harlan watched from his corner booth, every movement disguised as idle curiosity. His notebook remained hidden, but his eyes recorded everything: the sway of Chloe's arrogance, the measured silence of Maria, the tension in Daniel's jaw, the complacency in Agnes's glance. Each detail layered onto the picture forming in his mind. He compared Kane's diner with his own restaurants. Even his most disciplined kitchens, even his most seasoned staff never passed inspections without minor notes. A thermometer, slightly off a paper, misfiled a sink scrubbed twice instead of 3 times. Perfection in this industry was impossible. Yet here perfection had been documented for decades. He whispered the truth to himself, not as doubt, but as duty. This cannot be ignored. The decision settled into his bones. The disguise was no longer an experiment. It was a mission. Protecting his customers meant more than running clean kitchens. It meant tearing down the illusion that others could buy safety while endangering everyone else. The audience could feel the shift. Harlan was no longer just an observer tasting sandwiches. He had become an investigator, a witness determined to expose what lay hidden. The investigation had begun, and there would be no turning back. Maria approached with a pot of coffee, her steps quiet, her hand unsteady as she tilted the stream into Harlan's cup. The liquid rippled, a small tremor betraying more than fatigue. She kept her gaze, lowered her face, composed but pale. Harlan leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but pointed. "Is this place safe?" The question lingered between them. Maria froze the pot, hovering midair. For a moment, silence pressed harder than any noise in the diner. Then she answered, her words slow and rehearsed. "Everything here is always perfect." The phrase struck him. It was not assurance, it was warning disguised as loyalty. The way she said it carried the weight of fear, as though truth had been scrubbed away like fingerprints. Her lips formed a smile, but her eyes betrayed her, darting toward the kitchen, then back to the floor. To anyone else, it was meaningless small talk. To Harlan, it was confirmation. Maria knew more than she dared admit. Her reply was not denial, but a plea to stop asking, a desperate attempt to protect herself in a place where honesty carried punishment. The tension lingered unfinished, drawing the audience into the silence she left behind. Before Harlan could press further, Chloe Kane drifted over her perfume, sharp, her voice louder than the room required. She slid into the moment without invitation, smiling as though every conversation belonged to her. "You'll find we never have trouble here," she said breezily. "My uncle knows everyone who matters. Inspectors, council members, even the mayor's office. They all trust us. Why wouldn't they?" She let the names fall one by one like jewels displayed carelessly on velvet. The weight of her arrogance filled the air. Maria lowered her head, her shoulders shrinking inward as if trying to disappear. She dared not meet Harlan's eyes, not with Chloe so close. Harlan kept his posture relaxed, his expression neutral, but inside a current of anger surged. Every boast Chloe offered was another nail driven into the truth Maria could not voice. The power imbalance was glaring, one woman flaunting immunity, the other silenced by fear. To the listener, the injustice was sharp, almost unbearable. Arrogance reigned unchecked, and those who could speak the truth were forced deeper into silence. The illusion of harmony shattered when Victor Kane's voice cut through the diner. He had spotted Maria moving a fraction too slowly with a pitcher of water. His reprimand was swift, loud enough for every table to hear. "Is this how we serve our guests? Keep them waiting while you wander around." His words lashed her in public, stripping dignity with each syllable. Maria stood frozen, the tray trembling in her hands, her face burning with shame. Chloe laughed softly from nearby, adding, "She's always been clumsy. Uncle, you're too patient with her." The mockery carried more sting than the scolding itself. Around them, other employees kept their heads down, their eyes fixed on their tasks. No one intervened. No one dared. The atmosphere thickened with silent compliance. From his booth, Harlan's hand clenched beneath the table. The mask of calm nearly cracked. It was no longer about inspections or rumors. It was about dignity crushed in plain view, arrogance paraded as leadership, and fear drilled into every worker until silence became their only defense. The audience felt the heat of injustice rise, pressing closer with each word. The corruption was no longer hidden in backrooms or whispered deals. It was alive, breathing humiliating right before their eyes. Only minutes after humiliating Maria, Chloe Kane carried a steaming bowl of soup toward a table of elderly patrons. Her steps were careless, her focus elsewhere. The tray tilted, the bowl toppled, and hot liquid splattered across the floor, streaking shoes and skirts. The customers gasped, their faces tight with annoyance. Before the tension could spread, Victor Kane appeared instantly. His voice softened, his smile wide, his hands quick to grab a rag. "Accidents happen," he said warmly, crouching to mop the mess himself. "Everyone makes mistakes. That's life." Chloe offered a pout of embarrassment, but Victor's words shielded her from consequence. He even chuckled, patting her arm. "Don't worry, dear. You're only human." Across the room, employees exchanged glances. Some rolled their eyes, others bit their lips to suppress comments. They had seen the contrast too clearly. A spilled bowl from Chloe earned compassion. A slow pour from Maria had earned humiliation. The favoritism was no longer subtle. It was public, undeniable, and corrosive. The audience felt the unfairness press harder, rules bent for family cruelty reserved for the powerless. The image branded itself into memory, Victor kneeling to protect his niece while Maria still stood scarred by shame. The message was unmistakable. In Kane's world, justice bent to bloodline. Daniel Cruz wove between tables, balancing plates with the precision of necessity. His shoulders carried not just trays but the weight of rent bills and unborn children's futures. Yet, even his diligence drew Victor's glare. As Daniel set down a meal, Victor's voice sliced through the room. "This place has no room for those who question how we run things," he declared. The words were not casual, they were targeted. Daniel stiffened the tray in his hands, trembling slightly. His lips pressed shut, swallowing any reply. His jaw tightened, his breath held his anger trapped behind obedience. Harlan saw it. The fire in Daniel's eyes, quickly hidden, told a story louder than words. Here was a man crushed daily under Victor's shadow, yet unwilling to surrender his spirit. The silence around him was not submission, it was resistance, forced into hiding. The moment stretched tense and suffocating. Customers noticed only the raised voice. Staff recognized the threat beneath it. Daniel bore the insult like another burden added to his back. For the audience, the injustice tightened further. It was not only Maria enduring humiliation. Victor ruled by intimidation, ensuring fear outweighed dignity. And Daniel, a man with everything to lose, stood as another silent casualty. The tension pulsed like a warning. Fear was the law, defiance the crime. Later that afternoon, Chloe gathered with a cluster of regulars leaning into their table as though sharing a secret worth savoring. Her voice carried just enough to be overheard. "Inspector Nolan always gives us notice," she said with a grin. 3 days, sometimes more. Nothing ever catches us off guard." The men at the table burst into laughter, raising their glasses in mocking toasts. To them, it was a clever strategy, an inside joke at the expense of rules. From her station nearby, Maria stiffened. Her face drained of color, her hands trembling as she clutched a carafe. The truth, spoken so casually, exposed the chains she already knew bound them all. Harlan listened intently, every word etching deeper into his resolve. What had been rumor now became confession offered without hesitation in a crowded diner. It was not whispered in secret. It was paraded as pride. The audience felt the disgust sharpen. Corruption was not hidden, it was celebrated. The inspector sworn to protect the public was instead an accomplice, his betrayal woven into Chloe's laughter. For Harlan, each word became evidence. For the listener, each word became proof of a world where arrogance flourished and safety was sold. And the casual nature of her boast made it all the more revolting. Chloe leaned closer to her circle of guests, her smile curling with arrogance. "Sometimes all it takes is one lunch," she declared, "and every problem disappears." Her tone dripped with pride, as though corruption were not a crime but an accomplishment. The table erupted in applause, glasses raised in mock celebration. Their laughter rang out across the diner, not a whisper of shame in any corner of their joy. To them, the bribe was cleverness, the manipulation a badge of honor. Harlan's chest tightened. He watched the smirk play across Chloe's face, the sparkle of satisfaction in her eyes. This was not secrecy. It was flaunting power, daring anyone to oppose. Every clap at that table was another insult to the thousands of customers who trusted restaurants to protect their health. Near the counter, Maria's hands shook as she poured coffee. Her eyes avoided the scene, her body shrinking away from the noise. She didn't need to say a word. Her trembling told it all. She knew these lunches, she knew the truth behind the jokes, and her fear revealed the cost of such knowledge. The arrogance in Chloe's laughter clashed with the silence of those forced to endure it. For the audience, the contrast burned. Justice was mocked in daylight, and those who suffered beneath it had no voice. It was no longer speculation, it was admission broadcast with champagne and smiles. When the laughter subsided, Harlan turned slightly, his voice pitched low enough for Maria alone. "How long have you worked here?" Her reply was soft, almost invisible. 3 years. He nodded, then pressed further. "And in 3 years? Have you found it fair?" The question was gentle, but its weight landed hard. Maria's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes flickered to the kitchen door, then to the floor. Silence filled the space where truth longed to live. She clutched her notepad tightly as though words might slip from it if she wasn't careful. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. In that glance, Harlan saw desperation, the urge to speak, chained by fear. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a scream trapped beneath the skin. Then she turned away, muttering something about another table, her body retreating quickly into safety. The moment closed, but not fully. To Harlan, it was enough. The silence told him more than any confession. She had knowledge. She had seen enough. She was the witness who couldn't yet testify. The audience felt the suspense grip tighter. Maria stood on the edge of revelation, but fear held her back. The truth was present just one breath away. Chloe returned before the silence could settle, her voice sharp, her tone dripping disdain. "Don't waste your time with her," she said, waving at Maria as though dismissing a servant. "She's just staff. People like her will never understand how things really work." She tilted her wrist, showing off a gold bracelet that caught the light. "This is what power looks like." She continued. "Not coffee pots and aprons, but real influence. Real rewards." Her laugh was rehearsed enough to sting. The insult landed heavy. Maria lowered her head, eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders shrinking beneath the weight of humiliation. The sparkle of Chloe's jewelry mocked the plainness of Maria's uniform, the distance between privilege and survival stretching wide. Harlan remained quiet, his anger burning behind calm eyes. The contrast was undeniable. One woman elevated by corruption, another crushed by it. It was more than arrogance. It was cruelty wielded openly. For the audience, the image cut deep, Chloe glittering in borrowed power, Maria silenced in her labor. It was the portrait of inequality at its rawest. Harlan's silence in that moment was not weakness. It was calculation. And the memory of Chloe's words would soon sharpen into a weapon against her family's empire. In the kitchen's narrow heat, Daniel leaned close to Maria, his voice low but edged with exhaustion. "I can't take this anymore," he muttered, the tray in his hands trembling. His eyes, shadowed with sleepless nights, spoke louder than his words. Maria's head snapped up. Fear sharpened her tone. "Stop. You don't know how powerful they are. If anyone hears you." She glanced toward the door as though the walls themselves had ears. Daniel shook his head. "And if we stay silent, nothing changes. We'll live like this forever. Afraid, humiliated, used. Isn't that worse?" His jaw tightened, a man crushed by duty, yet unwilling to bow completely. Maria's lips pressed together, a silent plea for safety. But her silence only made his words heavier. At the edge of the kitchen, unnoticed, Harlan caught fragments of their exchange. Their whispered rebellion stirred something inside him. Hope was fragile, but it was alive, flickering beneath layers of fear. The audience could feel the weight of that spark. Resistance was not gone, it was only waiting for a chance to ignite. The chance vanished in an instant. The door swung open and Victor Kane stepped inside, his smile gone, his eyes cold. He had heard enough. He crossed the floor with slow precision, then gripped Daniel's shoulder like a vice. His voice cut through the air. "If you ever open your mouth, this entire city will close its doors on you." Each word pressed deeper, more suffocating than the grip itself. Daniel froze. His knuckles whitened against the tray, his breath locked inside his chest. No protest came, only silence. He knew the threat was no exaggeration. Maria stood still, her hands trembling around a coffee pot she hadn't realized she was holding. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, afraid even her heartbeat might betray them. Victor released Daniel with a shove, leaving his warning hanging like smoke that would never clear. Then he walked out as calmly as he had entered, carrying menace like a cloak. The room remained frozen long after his departure. Daniel's eyes, once burning, were dulled by fear. Maria's silence deepened into terror, and for the audience the cost of speaking truth was seared in memory. That night, Harlan sat in his office surrounded by silence, the glow of his computer screen casting sharp light across scattered files. He had heard the threats, seen the fear, but now he needed proof no denial could erase. He opened the inspection records for Kane's Diner. The pages looked pristine, unnaturally so. Report after report proclaimed perfection, spotless kitchens, flawless procedures glowing praise. Not one violation. Every signature belonged to the same man, Inspector Nolan. Year after year, his name alone marked the files. The timing was equally suspicious. Every surprise inspection fell neatly on the same day of the week, the same quiet hour when the diner was at its calmest. No business ran with such perfection. No inspector worked with such precision. The pattern was too clean, too rehearsed. Harlan leaned back, his breath slow but heavy. "There's a system behind this," he whispered to himself. It was no longer a suspicion. The corruption wasn't accidental. It was organized, polished, and deeply entrenched. The audience felt the shift evidence had surfaced, the game no longer in shadows. What had been whispers and arrogance now stood on record, waiting to be torn open. Harlan pulled up the inspection reports for his own restaurants. Even the cleanest kitchens, those he had poured years of discipline into, carried the occasional note: a thermometer miscalibrated, a mislabeled container, a late safety log. Minor flaws corrected instantly, but flaws nonetheless. Real businesses always left traces. Then he set those records beside Kane's Diner. The contrast was blinding. Not one correction, not one oversight, not even the smallest blemish. Every line screamed perfection year after year without exception. It was impossible. No human system worked without error. No kitchen functioned without moments of imperfection. Perfection here did not mean excellence, it meant fabrication. The realization surged through him like fire. The suspicion he had carried was no longer theory. The spotless reports were proof of falsification, stamped and signed in the open. For Harlan, the paradox was settled. Kane's Diner was not flawless, it was fraudulent. And for the audience, the weight of certainty landed with a crack. What had been whispers of corruption was now undeniable fact. The next evening, Harlan returned to Kane's Diner, not as the observer in shadows, but as the casual customer who blended easily into routine. He slid into a booth ordered with ease and waited. Chloe noticed him quickly. Her smile was sharp, curious. "So, where are you from? Do you know anyone in City Hall?" she asked, her tone playful but probing. Harlan leaned back unhurried. He offered a name he invented on the spot, a harmless fiction. Chloe's eyes brightened instantly. "Oh, him. Of course, he's one of my uncle's closest friends. Always helps us when we need something." She spoke without hesitation, without even realizing she had been baited. Harlan nodded with feigned interest, but inside he marked the words. She had stepped into the trap willingly, confirming the network extended far beyond an inspector. It reached City Hall itself. The satisfaction was subtle but sharp. She thought she was boasting. Instead, she was tightening the noose. The audience felt the quiet triumph. Arrogance had revealed more than interrogation ever could. With her guard down, Chloe continued. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, though she wanted to be overheard. "Inspector Nolan always gives us a few days' notice. That's how we stay perfect. He calls, Uncle adjusts the schedule, and by the time he arrives, everything shines." Her friends chuckled knowingly, lifting glasses to toast the brilliance of corruption. To them, it was a clever trick. To Harlan, it was the testimony he needed, spoken aloud in plain words in front of witnesses. Near the counter, Maria stood frozen, pale as porcelain. Her eyes darted between Chloe's careless grin and Harlan's calm focus. She knew the weight of those words. She had lived under them. And now someone else had finally heard. Harlan's thoughts sharpened. This is it. Witnesses' records, confessions. It's enough to break the silence. but tension cut through the room like glass. Chloe kept talking, unaware of how much she had given away. Maria trembled, afraid of what came next. Harlan sat still, gathering the threads of a case that could topple an empire. The audience felt the pull tighten. Justice was near, but danger was nearer. The diner shifted when Victor Kane walked in. His presence filled the space, heavy and commanding. He moved from table to table, greeting patrons with a booming voice, wearing the warmth of a genial host. Customers smiled, unaware of the sharpness beneath. But when he turned on his staff, the mask slipped. A young busboy had been slow clearing plates, and Victor's rebuke cracked like thunder, loud enough for every guest to hear. The boy stood paralyzed, face flushed with shame, while Victor's voice cut deeper. Then, almost in the same breath, Victor turned to Chloe, who had sauntered up with a pout. His tone softened instantly, eyes crinkling with affection. "Don't worry yourself, sweetheart," he said, patting her shoulder. "You're flawless." The duality was stark. Ruthless tyrant to his workers, doting uncle to Chloe. The hypocrisy clung to every gesture, every switch in tone. From his booth, Harlan studied the performance with clenched fists. The man's duplicity was not an act of survival, it was a choice polished over years, a weapon wielded with precision. The audience felt the disgust swell. Victor Kane was not just corrupt, he was two-faced, and every smile hid a knife. Later that evening, a middle-aged customer leaned across his table, curiosity spilling into his words. "How do you folks keep passing inspections without trouble?" Chloe's laugh rang out rich with pride. "That's easy," she said. "Our inspector is the most lenient man in the whole city." She winked as though sharing a clever inside joke. The customer chuckled, raising his glass. "Well, good for you. Not every place is that lucky." The exchange drew more laughter, small ripples of agreement among those within earshot. But to Harlan, the moment was electric. Each careless word Chloe uttered was another stone in the foundation of proof. This time it wasn't whispered behind booths or hinted in arrogance. It was said in front of customers out in the open, normalized as if corruption were just another service on the menu. Maria passed by her hands, trembling slightly as she refilled water. Her pale expression betrayed what the laughter masked. She knew the truth. This wasn't leniency, it was purchase. Harlan's pen moved across his notepad, silent but relentless. Every boast, every witness was another thread woven into a net that would one day close around the Kanes. The audience felt the injustice tighten like a vice. Power mocked honesty, and ordinary voices laughed along. When the night's rush ended, Harlan slipped into the alley behind the diner. Maria emerged moments later carrying a trash bag, her face weary from the weight of silence. He stepped forward carefully. "Maria," he said, his tone steady. "I need to talk." She froze, fear instantly flashing in her eyes. "If they know I spoke to you, I'll lose everything." Her voice cracked, her grip on the bag unsteady. Harlan's gaze held hers. "I can protect you, but I can't do this without you. You've seen what they hide. You know what's at stake." Tears welled in her eyes, glistening in the dim light. She wanted to believe, wanted to escape the suffocating fear, but the cost loomed large. Harlan took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're not alone. With your help, this ends. Not just for you, for everyone who's been silenced." Maria's shoulders shook. A single tear fell as she nodded faintly, the first sign of surrender to hope. For the audience, the shift was clear. A fragile alliance had formed in the shadows, one that carried both risk and possibility. The alley behind the diner was dim and narrow, littered with crates and the sour smell of waste. Daniel stepped out for a breath of air, only to freeze when Victor's shadow fell over him. Victor's hand clamped hard on his shoulder. His voice was low but sharp enough to cut skin. "One word, Daniel. Just one, and your career is over. You'll never serve coffee in this city again." Daniel's chest heaved. His lips parted, but no reply came, only a strangled silence. His face drained of color as the weight of the threat sank in. From the deeper shadows, Harlan stood still, fists tight at his sides. Every instinct screamed to step in, but he held himself back, knowing evidence mattered more than rage. He watched, memorizing each cruel syllable, each calculated gesture. Daniel's shoulders sagged under Victor's grip, spirit buckling under fear. The intimidation was complete, and Victor released him with the same casual air as tossing trash. For Harlan, the scene branded itself into memory. The threats weren't rumor. They were reality wielded like chains. The audience felt the choke of fear as though Victor's hand gripped them too. Back in his office, Harlan drowned in files. He pulled every inspection record connected to Kane's diner tracing lines that stretched further than he imagined. The pattern stretched not just years, but decades. 2 decades of spotless perfection across multiple inspectors across administrations, never a single violation. Even restaurants that he himself ran clean, disciplined, professional had the occasional blemish. But here, everything was immaculate, as though dirt and error had never existed. Harlan dug deeper, searching older archives. The records extended back to Victor's father. Patrick Kane's era showed the same flawless history, the same glowing praise written in different hands but with identical tone. It wasn't chance, it was tradition, a chain of corruption passed like inheritance woven into the diner's legacy. Harlan leaned back, staring at the impossible sequence of perfection. This was no isolated bribe, it was a machine smooth and silent, built to endure. The shock of its scale settled over him like ice. What he faced wasn't just one man's scheme, it was a dynasty. The audience felt the ground widen beneath them. The corruption was not temporary, it was generational. Harlan pressed his hands against the desk, staring at the mountain of evidence. His pulse was steady, but each beat carried dread. This wasn't bribery anymore, it was infrastructure. The Kanes hadn't simply bought silence, they had built a power structure that outlasted inspectors, mayors, entire administrations. It was hereditary, passed from father to son, uncle to niece, each generation grooming the next in manipulation. The system didn't just tolerate corruption, it was fueled by it. The inspectors weren't guardians, they were partners. The city itself had become a shield for the diner's lies. What began as payments had evolved into an empire of protection, untouchable, unseen, accepted as part of the order of things. Harlan's jaw clenched as the truth set in. He was not fighting one corrupt family or one crooked inspector. He was staring at a network that had grown roots deep into the city's foundation. The chill of that realization was profound. His enemy wasn't a single diner, it was an institution wrapped in smiling faces and fake reports. The audience felt the dread rise. Justice was no longer a simple fight. It was a war against a system designed to never fall. Daniel found Harlan one night away from the diner, his steps, hesitant eyes, red with exhaustion. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking as though danger might be listening. "I once called in a real violation," Daniel confessed, voice shaking. "The freezer was broken. Food wasn't safe. Customers could have gotten sick." His words cracked into silence, then returned with weight. But Nolan shut it down. "He told me if I kept making noise, I'd never work again." His hands trembled as tears welled, spilling without shame. "I wasn't trying to fight anyone. I just wanted people safe." Harlan gripped his shoulder firmly. "It won't be for nothing. What you've carried alone, we'll use it to bring them down." For Daniel, relief mingled with fear, a fragile release. For Harlan, it was another stone in the wall of truth, undeniable, human heavy. The audience felt the sting of sacrifice, Daniel's courage scarred, but unbroken, his testimony proof of real harm ignored. In a quiet corner, Agnes Miller wiped down a table with the weary hands of someone who had carried secrets too long. She didn't mean to speak, but years of silence cracked into words. "I've worked here 15 years. Every inspection feels the same. Same man, same smile, same outcome. Always perfect." Harlan froze. The casual confession struck deeper than she realized. Agnes wasn't accusing, she was simply stating routine, the routine of corruption masked as order. When he pressed, her eyes darted away. Who would ever challenge Victor? "We all know what happens if you try." Her voice fell into silence, heavy, defeated. Harlan saw it clearly. Her statement was indirect evidence, living proof that fear was the real enforcer. Her silence was not apathy, it was survival. For the audience, the paradox hit hard. Decades of inspections had become theater repeated until the lie felt natural. And the longer it lasted, the stronger the silence grew. The pieces were in place. Daniel's courage, Agnes's weary truth, Maria's trembling silence, all threads that pointed toward one rotten core. Harlan no longer doubted. He had enough to expose Victor, but he needed one decisive blow. The plan began quietly. He reached out to his network of restaurant owners, presenting the idea as a celebration of the industry. An anniversary gathering, a chance to honor exemplary compliance. Victor couldn't resist. His pride demanded recognition, and Chloe's vanity would push him to attend. What they didn't know was that the event was a stage built for their downfall. Behind the scenes, Harlan invited not only colleagues but legal counsel, compliance officers, and journalists hungry for truth. Hidden eyes would watch, hidden ears would record every careless boast turned into evidence. As he sealed the invitations, Harlan felt the weight of inevitability. The trap was set, the bait irresistible. For the audience, the suspense thickened. The empire was about to walk willingly into its own collapse. In the days leading up to the celebration, Victor walked taller, his voice louder, his laughter sharper. Each night at the diner, he reminded his staff how spotless their reputation was, how every guest should feel privileged to eat in the cleanest kitchen in the city. His pride had become a performance, and no one dared interrupt. Chloe matched his arrogance with youthful bravado. She flaunted her jewelry, bragged about connections, her voice dripping with superiority. She spoke as though the family were royalty, untouchable above both law and conscience. At the tables, Maria and Daniel continued their work, moving like shadows. Their eyes, however, betrayed the weight of despair. They had witnessed the rot lived beneath its shadow, and still they carried trays and poured coffee as though nothing had changed. Every gesture was survival, not service. Harlan watched it all quietly, the patience of a hunter guiding his calm. Each boast was another thread woven into his snare, each careless word another nail in their coffin. He let their arrogance grow unchecked, knowing it would be their undoing. For the audience, the tension was palpable. The rope had been pulled tight. Everyone waited for it to snap. The anniversary banquet filled with voices and clinking glasses. Victor Kane stood at the center, commanding attention with the ease of a man convinced of his own invincibility. He lifted his wine-high smile, stretching broad across his face. "To my family," he declared, "and to this diner, the cleanest, proudest establishment in the city. 20 years without a single stain. We are the standard every restaurant dreams of reaching." Applause echoed, though it was forced in parts. Maria and Daniel clapped with trembling hands, their faces pale in the glow of Victor's pride. Behind them, staff looked to the ground, too afraid to break the illusion. Chloe, radiant beside her uncle, chimed in without hesitation. "That's right. No one does it better. No inspector has ever dared question us." She tossed her hair with a flourish, eyes glittering. The scene was almost unbearable. Arrogance stood dressed as honor, corruption toasted as achievement. Harlan sat among the crowd, his silence deeper than their cheers. The mask of their empire had never looked shinier or closer to cracking. The audience burned with dislike. The Kanes had climbed to their highest peak of pride. The higher they rose, the harder the fall would strike. Wine loosened Chloe's tongue, and pride carried her further than caution ever could. She leaned over the table, laughing too loud, her voice carrying through the room. 3 days, she boasted. "That's how much notice Inspector Nolan gives us. Every time. We fix whatever's wrong before he arrives. And when he does, it's perfect, every single report." Her friends cheered, raising glasses again. She basked in their applause, never noticing the silence that spread across the staff. Maria froze mid-step, her hand tightening on a tray. Daniel's pulse quickened, eyes darting to her in disbelief. The secret had been spoken laid bare for strangers and staff alike. The words fell heavy. They weren't whispered behind booths or passed in coded hints. They were shouted into a room filled with witnesses. Maria's gaze locked with Daniel's. Fear-dread and something like hope flickered between them. The truth was out, not in hidden records, not in suspicion, but from Chloe's own lips. Harlan's heart pounded steady. The confession he had been chasing for weeks had walked into the open, unguarded and undeniable. The audience felt the air crackle with tension. Pride had finally betrayed itself. The empire was unraveling one drunken boast at a time. Victor, drunk on his own bravado, leaned into the silence Chloe had left behind. His grin widened as he raised his glass once more. "Sometimes," he boomed, "I even help Nolan with his daughter's tuition. That man is loyal because he knows who feeds his family." The room froze. The laughter died mid-breath. Faces turned pale, eyes darting between shock and disbelief. Maria's tray rattled in her hands, Daniel's jaw clenched. Victor mistook their silence for awe and laughed again, the sound hollow in the heavy air. He didn't see Harlan rise from the corner, no longer a shadow, but a figure walking into the light. The confession was complete, spoken in his own voice, his own pride. For the audience, the jolt landed sharp. The mask had slipped, and Victor Kane had condemned himself. The air cracked when Harlan's voice rang out steady. "My name is Harlan West. I own 23 restaurants across this state." Gasps rippled through the banquet. In unison, lawyers rose, journalists lifted recorders, investigators pulled badges. The trap had closed its teeth gleaming under the lights. Victor's face collapsed into disbelief, his mouth opening but no words forming. Chloe staggered back, her skin drained of color, her glittering arrogance gone. At the far end, Maria's sob broke the silence, followed by Daniel's choked exhale. Relief spread like fire. Fear was finally cracking. Harlan's eyes never left Victor. The Empire had been unmasked, its power dismantled in a single breath. The audience felt it surge. Betrayal overturned justice, striking at last. Harlan's words cut through the silence. Every word you spoke has been recorded. Victor was taken away. Nolan's shield collapsed, and for the first time Maria and Daniel stood free, their fear replaced by protection. Chloe, stripped of arrogance, wept as she agreed to testify. Justice tasted simple like the sandwich Harlan finished in quiet triumph. Corruption survives only when silence feeds it. Exposing truth is never easy, but it protects every worker, every customer, every family that deserves safety. Demand accountability, refuse complacency, because fairness once won belongs to us all.